It's incredibly sharp, it's got fantastic colour, it's pretty cheap, and this lens has a special trick up its sleeve if you want to know which vintage lens I'm talking about. Keep watching. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. Here is this week's lens. This is the micro NIKKOR 55mm f3.5 macro lens, and that's the trick that this lens has up its sleeve. It's a macro lens. It can take you into the world of very small things. Now, this is a lens that many viewers have recommended that I try on account of its extraordinary optical qualities, and having used it, I can confirm that all of that is true. Those fantastic optical qualities that are enthused about all over the internet absolutely are there. If I turn the camera, you can see the very deeply dished front element there that many of these vintage macro lenses have. This one is no exception, and it follows the standard pattern. It's a 2:1 macro lens, not a 1:1 macro lens. 1:1 is usually considered to be full macro, so this one would usually be considered to be half macro. Now, if you're using a 1:1 lens, let me explain that ratio. Let's assume you're at minimum focus distance on the lens and you're photographing an object that's, say, 1 centimetre tall. So here's your object, you're at minimum focus distance. So at that minimum focus distance, the 1 centimetre tall object will appear projected onto the sensor, and it will appear 1 centimetre high on the sensor. With a 2:1 lens, of course, if you're shooting that same 1 centimetre high object, then that will appear as half a centimetre projected onto the sensor. So that's the relationship. 1:1, the object is the same size at minimum focus distance as it is in reality that it is on the sensor. And at 2:1, a 2:1 lens, you get a 50% size projected image onto your lens. But this lens can still take you into the world of very tiny things, and it really is a fascinating world, and I've had a lot of fun exploring it with this lens. It's a world that's all around us, and when you go down to that scale, we never usually see it, but when you go down to that scale, my gosh, a whole new universe of stuff opens up, and it can be really fascinating to photograph. I don't know, I like to photograph flowers, insects, if I can manage to keep them still enough. Just very small things I find fascinating to photograph because it does open up this whole different universe. This is one of the lenses that can do it. This lens was first manufactured in 1961, and it was made right up until the late 70s. So that's really a very long production run. The oldest ones were single coated, as I understand it, gaining multi-coatings later on in the production run. I'm just wondering if we can, there we are, there are the coatings on this one. The signature Nikon greeny, purpley type of coatings. This lens is a multi-coated version, and it's one of the last manufactured, dating from, I think, the late 70s. At infinity, you'll see that this lens is no bigger than any other 50mm or 55mm. It's pretty average size for that sort of focal length, but when we extend the lens towards its minimum focus distance, you can see that it gets quite a lot longer, almost an inch longer. It's got the macro markings on the barrel here. I don't know if you can see those clearly. It's a very nicely made lens in the Nikon tradition. It's all metal, of course, as all the vintage lenses were. There may be actually a tiny bit of plastic somewhere, although I'm not even sure that there is any plastic at all in this lens. It seems to be almost all metallic as far as I can see. There's the rear element. This one does need a little bit of lubrication. It's slightly slack. It's not quite as silky and buttery smooth as it really ought to be, but that's fine. It's in more than good enough condition to use as it is. If I show you the front element again, you'll see how very deeply recessed that element is. It's, gosh, how deep? Well, it's about that deep. From here to here, so that's a very well shielded front element, so you're not going to get too much flaring and washing out of contrast. The light would have to be pretty strong to do that, because that front element is very well protected. And it's the same story if we look at an Olympus macro 2:1 macro lens. This is the 50mm f3.5. You'll see that that too has a very recessed element. It's not quite as recessed as the Nikon. It's only up to here. The Nikon went right up to here. So I'm measuring in parts of finger lengths, but nevertheless the Olympus 2 does have that recess, and this is a feature we find across pretty much all of these 50mm 2:1 macros of the 60s and 70s. What's this lens like to actually shoot and to use? Well, I really enjoyed using it. I found it a lovely lens to use. I did enjoy looking at small things with it. I really did like that, and I love the way these macro lenses take you into the world of very tiny things. There it is, all around us, waiting to be discovered. This lens will unlock it, whether it's flowers, insects, little drops of dew on blades of grass, close-ups of coins, close-ups of skin, whatever it is, it's opening up a whole new world of tiny little things to explore, and that was fun. However, I also used it for general photography too, and there's no reason this can't be a dual purpose lens, part general photography, part macro. And in fact, it's a pretty good lens for general walk around photography. It's f3.5, so it's not really a blur monster, but it is really, really sharp, and that's something that quite a few of these 60s, 70s 2:1 macros share. They're very, very sharp. In fact, the Pentax version, the Pentax f4 50mm macro, which I used to have, that's so sharp that for a time it was considered to be the sharpest lens in the world, bar none. And having used it, I can easily understand why that was the case, because it is astonishingly sharp. This one isn't far behind. In fact, it might not be behind at all. If it is, there's only just a hair's breadth of difference in it. It's a very, very sharp lens under all circumstances and pretty much at any distance. This lens renders possibly one of the sharpest, certainly one of the sharpest vintage lenses that I've ever used. Whether it's the sharpest vintage macro, I really don't know, but it's certainly a very sharp lens, and it will give you some very sharp images. It renders massive amounts of detail. There is no chance that you're going to miss any detail with this one. If you want to crop, if you've got one of the most recent cameras with 40, 50, 60 megapixels, if you want to crop, this gives you an image more than sharp enough to do that. You're going to crop in and you're not going to think, oh gosh, we've really lost some detail here. Everything's here with this lens. Very, very sharp optic indeed. Focusing though to achieve that sharp image is not as easy as it is with many other lenses at both very short distances, macro distances, and longer distances. It's tricky with macro because you have very, very limited depth of field at those very tiny short distances. All you've got behind you, if you shoot wide open at f3.5, all you've got behind you is a massive wall of blur with all the detail washed out and nothing visible, and a very, very tiny plane of focus. So it's quite important, if you're focusing at those distances, to use a tripod or some other means of anchoring and planting the camera firmly so it's not going to move. If you try and do it handheld like this with your camera to your eye, tiny little movements that you make, inevitable tiny movements that you make, are going to mean that you're going to find it very, very difficult to get sharp focus on that particular point. So it's best used with a tripod at very short distances, and it's also best to stop it right down so that you increase your plane of focus from very, very tiny, very, very thin to maybe an inch or so. That would be enough to get a sharp macro image with all of your subject in focus in most cases. At longer distances, it's a little tricky to focus, and I did miss focus sometimes because the difference between being in and out of focus is only a very tiny movement on the focusing ring. So it's so easy. You've got such a tiny, tiny little area of accuracy when you're trying to focus that it's so easy to miss focus. And I did do that a couple of times. It wasn't awful, but I did find I lost more shots than I would with you know, an average vintage 50 that I might otherwise more usually use. So care needs to be taken in focusing this lens. Not quite as easy as some others to focus. It's got absolutely fantastic colour and contrast. Colours are very rich, very deep, very striking and very saturated. I shot it on the standard profile on my old OG original A7 here, and the colours look like I've shot them on the vivid profile. That's how much colour this lens pumps into an image. It really is quite something. A very highly saturated lens, and in fact that's the kind of image I like. I do like colours to be a little bit bumped up, a little more than they are in the real world when you you know, look around at reality, whatever that is. So just nice colours, really nice colours, very strong contrast also that supports the strength of those colours. The front element is deeply recessed, so generally in most situations you don't need a hood with this lens. It has pretty good protection anyway. That said, if you point directly into the sun, it will wash out and it will lose contrast just like any other lens, whether it's vintage or modern, but this one doesn't do it quite so easily as many others, perhaps even most others do, because it has got that very deeply recessed front element to give it lots of protection right out of the box. As for background blur, well, of course, shooting at closer distances, macro distances, it's got lots and lots and lots of it. The more it gets, the nearer you go to your subject. If you use it for general photography, well, it's got some blur, but it's an f3.5 55mm, so this is not going to be the blurriest lens in the world at general photography distances, and in fact it isn't. As for the quality of the blur, I didn't find it particularly nice, generally speaking. There were points where it turned nice and soft, and there was this lovely softness in the background. What blur there is, there's not a great deal from an f3.5 lens, but there is some. And occasionally it could become very nice, very smooth, very beautiful, and give a lovely soft feel to the background of a shot. More usually, it's just a rag-bag jumble and a bit of a mess, to be honest. If you shoot foliage, you'll see that specular highlights are not very well organised. They're not particularly coherent. They don't have any particular form. They don't follow any particular pattern. They're just a mess of specular highlights, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason in the way that they are generated. So not a particularly pleasing background blur for the most part, although it can be nice and smooth when the conditions are right. As for chromatic aberration, yes, there is some, but very, very little. And I did have to work really hard to find examples of chromatic aberration on this lens. It's well known for having good optical performance, for having a very nice optical construction. And I think perhaps as a result of that, it just doesn't have too much fringing going on, neither of the green nor the purple variety. So very, very good performance in terms of chromatic aberration for this lens. Vignetting, yes, it vignettes as well, and that surprised me. I thought that a lens that it only opens up to f3.5 would display the characteristics that some lenses that open wider display at f3.5. That is, not very much in the way of dark corners. However, this one surprised me. It does give dark corners at f3.5. If you stop down to f5.6, that is gone. And much of the time, I would imagine this lens would be used at f5.6 or smaller. Certainly for macro work you would need to do that, and if you're shooting on the street or doing general photography of some kind, there's no real point in keeping your aperture open for background blur, because this lens doesn't make very much of it anyway. So I would imagine much of the time it will be stopped down to those apertures. But if you shoot wide open and you're shooting against a bright light like the sky or something like that, yes, you will have some dark corners, but you know, it's not dreadful. They're only moderate and they do go away when you stop down just a little bit. So all in all, this is a lovely little lens. It's available for, prices seem to be in the region of about £60 to about £100, and I would assume that's pretty similar in the USA and in other countries of the world. So this is not an expensive lens. It's a great walk around general lens, and it's a really fantastic little macro lens as well that will do 2:1 natively, or if you put a tube on it, an extension tube, then it will do 1:1 full macro. So a really nice piece of kit that isn't too expensive and is pretty widely available, and if you're patient and persistent you will get it for less than £60, no doubt about it. I didn't. I paid £60 for this one, and there's quite a few of them on eBay right at the moment. So yeah, around about £60 to £100 will get you this lovely little fantastic 2:1 macro plus general walk around lens too. A very, very nice lens, very sharp, plenty of bumped up colour, got a little trick up its sleeve in that it can shoot macro, and it's pretty cheap as well. What's not to like? I think it's a fantastic little optic. So there are lenses from other manufacturers that do pretty much the same as the Nikon does. This is the Olympus version, the 50mm f3.5 2:1 macro. I've mentioned the Pentax version that I used to have. All the major manufacturers made one of these. There's probably a Canon one as well. And there are some nice third-party macros as well if you want to play around with those. I've recently looked at the Sigma 90mm f2.8. That was a nice macro lens. So there are a lot of, you know, fairly cheaply available macro lenses around, all in the same price region, all around £60 to £100. So I guess you pays your money and you takes your choice. There's certainly plenty out there. So that's about it from me for today, but before I go, I'll just mention what's coming up. We've got reviews of lots more vintage lenses. Those are coming up, and there is news on the Sony A7 front, on the Sony camera front. My old Sony A7 that I bought in 2013 is still in good working order, but it's got close to 100,000 shots on it, and it's time to retire it. The tech has moved on, so I'm changing it and I'm getting another camera. In fact, I've got another camera. It's another Sony camera and it's filming you right now, so I'll be doing some I'll be doing a review on that camera and comparing it to the A7. That's coming up in an episode pretty soon. If there's anything you would like to see, then any lens or any bit of photographic kit that you would like to see me review, then just put a comment down in the box below, and if I can do it, then I will make it for you. That said, that is it from me for today. Many thanks for tuning in and watching. I really do appreciate people tuning in and watching the show. If you've enjoyed this show, you might want to consider chucking us a sub. That would be very much appreciated. Many thanks to subscribers for your support. I really do appreciate that support. That is a heartfelt thanks to you. And many thanks go to patrons for your support. Without that support, I couldn't make the show in the way that I do. So many thanks to you for that support also. That is very much appreciated. If you like the material on this channel, then you might consider becoming a patron yourself. You can do it over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that for as little as $1 per month. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in, given thanks, super thanks, or engaged with the channel in any way. I really do appreciate it. Thank you everybody for checking in and tuning in. Much appreciated. As for me, that is it for this week. But if you're not doing anything too bothersome, irritating, or irksome around this time next week, please do consider joining me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.